Well, Dr. Naomi Oreskes and Dr. Erik Conway are the co-authors of the incredibly important and influential book, Merchants of Doubt, and they've written a new book, The Big Myth: How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. Dr. Conway, welcome, and Dr. Oreskes, welcome back to the Climate Pod.
Thank you.
Well, The Big
Happy to
Myth
be here.
reads like it's a prequel to the Merchants of Doubt. What were the themes that arose from Merchants of Doubt that you wanted to explore in The Big Myth?
In writing Merchants of Doubt, we looked at the retirement careers of a number of senior American physicists to try to understand how they became involved in long-running campaigns of denial of various kinds of environmental problems. And what we concluded there was that the answer was market fundamentalism. They fundamentally believed that government was in the way of prosperity and business freedom. And this is also, of course, all wrapped up in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so market fundamentalism became our theme. And in The Big Myth, what we just set out to do was tell the story of market fundamentalism, where it came from and how it came to be so dominant in American society and government.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about the market in this book, but each time we do so, I want the audience to know that we're using air quotes because there is no such thing as the market. And that's a big point in this book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the points we make in the book is that the big myth has a number of components. And the first component is the very notion of the free market, the idea that there could be such a thing as the free market that exists outside of society, outside politics, outside law and regulation. That's a myth. Markets have been around for a long time. We have evidence of markets going back as far as we have evidence of human civilization. And there have always been rules and regulations about how they operate. And that's no different today. So creating the idea of something that could stand apart from society so that it could even be logical to talk about government intervention or government encroachment is a foundational part of the construction of the myth.
Well, this book walks through so many examples of a glaring market flaw, then the proposed regulations to fix that flaw, and then the industrial opposition to it. And I don't want to go through all of them, but I do want to talk about this one stat featured early in the book and what happened as a result from it. You wrote that a young man born in America in 1899 would have actually been safer at age 15 going to fight in World War I than going to work on the railroads. What was happening at the time that made work so dangerous for young people? And what happened when regulations were proposed to make working conditions safer for everyone, especially children?
Well, that's my favorite statistic in the whole book, too, because it's a reminder of how incredibly dangerous, how incredibly brutal and violent American capitalism was in the early 20th century. Workplaces, particularly industrial workplaces, manufacturing plants, and the railroads were incredibly dangerous. 1 in every 1,000 workers was either killed or seriously injured on the job every year in the early 20th century. That would be the equivalent of 1.5 million people every year today. So it'd be like having a COVID pandemic every year. And in fact, people talked about it as an epidemic of workplace injury. They talked about it as an industrial war. And they used the term the accident crisis. And so this led a number of reformers to suggest that something needed to be done to address this terrible situation. And one of the things they did was to travel to Europe to ask the question, well, why was workplace injury and death so much less in Germany and the United Kingdom, even though those countries were as industrialized, or not more so, than the United States? And the answer, the conclusion they came to, was workmen's compensation. That these countries had programs of workmen's compensation in which employers paid into an insurance fund, which was then used to pay workers, to compensate workers that had been injured, or if they were killed, to compensate their survivors. The workmen's compensation program, because it was a kind of insurance, created a positive incentive for manufacturers and the railroads to have safer workplaces, because their premiums would be higher if the workplaces were dangerous, and they'd be lower if the workplace was safer. And so the proposal was to adopt something like that in the United States, which in fact we did. And today we all take workmen's compensation for granted. We have an expectation that if you're hurt on the job, there should be some support. But that reform was bitterly fought by American industrialists who posed it as a threat to not just business freedom, but to American freedom broadly. And so in that story, we find the kernels of the argument that then we trace throughout the rest of the 20th century and up until the present day.
You mentioned freedom a couple times. That word freedom is thrown around quite a bit when arguing against regulations, especially economic regulations. What is the indivisibility thesis, and how was that, the foundation of this idea of market fundamentalism?
We talk a lot about a thing called the tripod of freedom, which was a construct of the National Association of Manufacturers during the 1930s. And its purpose was to explain to and propagandize the American people into believing that business freedom, that industrial freedom was on a par with the Bill of Rights, the free speech rights, free assembly rights, and so forth. And if you removed industrial freedom, businessmen's freedom to do whatever you wanted, then you would lose those other freedoms as well. And that's the construct for the indivisibility thesis.
And it's important to add that it is a construct. It's an invention, because if you read the Declaration of Independence or you read the Constitution of the United States, the words free enterprise do not appear. Free enterprise was not foundational to the conception of the United States, but the National Association of Manufacturers constructs it as if it is, in order to make the point that if you compromise one leg of this tripod, then the entire structure will crumble.
Yeah, I mean, was America's own industrialization and just rapid growth, economic growth, a result of a hands-off government?
Well, no, certainly not. I mean, in the 19th century, the state governments primarily, but governments still actually invested heavily in various kinds of economic improvements, like roads and bridges, and they would often set up corporations to operate those things, right? The kind of the famous one is the Erie Canal Corporation that still exists. And those corporations differed from kind of 20th century corporations in that they were really chartered by the state, and they were chartered to serve state purposes. And so we might see them now as kind of public-private partnerships. But that's the whole idea, is that the states were actively involved in economic development. It was not a purely free enterprise idea. As we was just explaining, that concept didn't really exist.
Rural electrification, or the lack thereof, is a great example of businesses not wanting to solve social problems that wouldn't generate huge profits. What was the National Electric Light Association's response to America's push for rural electrification?
Well, the response was to fight it tooth and nail with a very massive propaganda campaign. And it's important to frame this argument because the campaign about rural electrification is sort of the second major theme that comes up in the book. So the first one has to do with what we call the social costs of capitalism, that industrialists doing things that are legal, like manufacturing carpets or shoes, are still nevertheless injuring and hurting huge numbers of people. But there's also another kind of failure that becomes evident in this part of the century, which is market failure, the failure of the private sector to provide goods or services that people need and want. And the clearest example was electricity, because by the 1920s, most urban Americans living in big cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis had electricity. They loved it. People thought electricity was very good. It was safer and cleaner than forms of lighting that people had had before. And it was increasingly coming to be seen as a necessity. But rural customers did not have it because private utilities operating under a profit motive did not see the possibility of making profits sufficient to justify stringing expensive electric transmission lines into rural areas. And so a number of reformers led by Gifford Pinchot, the progressive Republican governor of Pennsylvania, proposed that the state should become involved. And he proposed something called giant power, which was going to be a public-private partnership. So it wasn't Soviet-style take over the electricity market, but a partnership to ensure that all rural customers, in this case in Pennsylvania, would get power. The industry responded by a massive disinformation campaign intended both to discredit Pinchot, to discredit the possibility of state or municipal generated power, but even more than that, to construct the ideology of free enterprise capitalism as the American way of life. And so in the book, we document how they funded academics in a very Merchants of Doubt style to write reports challenging the scientific evidence or the economic evidence of how electricity was working, to claim that private sector electricity was cheaper than public sector electricity, even though the evidence suggested that that wasn't true. They paid academics to rewrite textbooks to promote the idea of free market capitalism. And of course, all of this was highly ironic because the electricity industry wasn't actually a free market. It was a regulated, what people at the time called a natural monopoly, so a regulated public utility. And this for us was really, I think, shocking to discover and write about, because when we were writing Merchants of Doubt, we thought, and I think we probably even said, that these strategies and tactics, hiring experts for hire, false reports, disinformation, that this had all been invented by the tobacco industry. Well, we now know that that's not true. I won't say it was invented by the electricity industry, because in our next book, we might discover something even older, but it was certainly cultivated and developed by the electricity industry in the United States in the 1920s.
Well, interestingly enough, NELA dissolved, but then was basically reincarnated as the Edison Electric Institute. And that is still around today and has funded countless fossil fuel disinformation campaigns while actually being led by a climate change denier. Do you think there's something inherent to the electricity industry that really has kept it at the forefront of opposition to government intervention, especially regulations that were intended to actually make the lives of everyone better?
It's nothing intrinsic to the technology of electricity, which can be promoted in, we can make electricity in lots of different ways. We can transmit it in different ways. But there is a commonality of interest, and as well as a commonality of institutions that perpetuates, I think, that a culture of large scale projects, and as well as antipathy to the governments that fundamentally regulate them. And you see that with, California is an odd mixture of both public and private utilities, and with different regulatory authorities. And even though our utilities are set up kind of strangely based to the rest of the United States, to put it in a short way, California utilities don't make money like selling electricity. They make money by building new stuff, and yet they still follow the same basic political imperatives, even though the structure of the industry here is a bit different. And to me, that's a matter of the enculturation of the executives, the engineers throughout the land, et cetera. So it's yeah, I see it as a cultural problem.
Well, that cultural problem, I think, is very deliberately constructed. And I think that's one of the big takeaways of
absolutely
the book, is just how deliberate and well-funded and well-executed this strategy was. And, I thought the story about how William Luhnow and Ed Crane basically wanted the free market version of Karl Marx, because they saw how influential Marx was to the left, and basically they wanted their own version for the right and for free market capitalism. So what did they do?
So the two people you referred to, it's Harold Luhnow and Jasper Crane. So that's okay. Jasper Crane was a DuPont executive. Harold Luhnow was the head of what might be America's first libertarian foundation, the Volcker Fund. No relation to Paul Volcker of the Fed. And these two men were associated with the National Association of Manufacturers. They were also associated with and helped to fund the Mont Pelerin Society, which was the first society that was created consciously and deliberately to promote neoliberal thinking, neoliberal ideology. So they were very aware of what was going on in Europe, and they were particularly well aware of the work of Friedrich von Hayek, who's considered one of the founders of modern neoliberalism. So they had the idea that they would bring Hayek to America. and they would popularize his work, but also they would try to make a version of it that would be more resonant with the American people. So if you read the book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, it's a very European book. Most of the argument is about Soviet-style communism. Most of the examples are taken from Europe, and it's a pretty intellectual book. It's not an easy read. So Lunow and Crane decide, and as you said, what they want is Das Kapital for free market fundamentalism. And they even say that, Das Kapital is kind of the Bible of communism, or the Communist Manifesto. Mein Kampf was the Bible of Nazism, and we need the Bible of market fundamentalism. So they do a couple of things. They pay for von Hayek to come to the United States and do a big book tour. They popularize his work by helping to arrange for a much shorter, much simplified, and frankly misrepresentative version of the book to be published in Reader's Digest. And we know that that was distributed probably to something like 9 or 10 million Americans. So very, very widely distributed. And then they create a cartoon version of the book, literally cartoons, little course with captions, in which the story is actually reversed. So Hayek's initial argument is about Soviet-style centralized planning and why centralized planning is a bad idea. And many of aspects of his argument, are actually pretty sensible. But he kind of takes it to an illogical extreme by saying, so therefore any government engagement in the marketplace is a threat to freedom. In the Reader's Digest, and particularly the cartoon version, they change the enemy to be Nazis, which is a better enemy for Americans who are coming out of World War II and know that they hate Nazis. So now the enemy is the Nazi, and in the cartoon version, the story is the government becomes involved in the marketplace during war mobilization, which nearly all Americans had supported, but actually that was a bad thing because it's going to lead us on a slippery slope to totalitarianism. And the final cartoon is a picture of a firing squad shooting a dissenter. And so this version of the story, a kind of flattened, very black and white, very Manichaean version of the argument, is then promoted to the American people to say that if the government plays any role in the economy at all, even something that might seem worthwhile, like Social Security, this is putting us on the road to serfdom.
And Hayek, obviously very influential in the early stages of the Chicago School of Economic Thought, like Milton, Friedman, and many others. How influential was the University of Chicago in the perpetuation of market fundamentalism?
Should I continue, Eric, or do you want to jump in? Yeah, okay.
That was your work, so.
Yeah, so super influential. So after doing all this work to promote a sort of simplified version of the neoliberal argument, they arrange to have von Hayek hired at the University of Chicago, but they don't do it by advertising the position. They work behind closed doors. And it turns out, actually, over the opposition of the economics department, they promised to pay von Hayek's salary and also to pay for a project called the Free Market Project. And this is extremely important because, well, for one thing, von Hayek becomes a very, very influential figure in right-wing American circles. In later years, he'll be cited by George H.W. Bush, by Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Ted Cruz. So he becomes really, really influential. Whether or not these people have actually read the book, hard to say, but we have pretty good evidence that Ronald Reagan read the Reader's Digest version. So von Hayek himself becomes a kind of linchpin of right-wing thinking in America, but it goes a lot further. And in some ways, maybe these other parts are even more important. So as part of this project that they fund, which they call the Free Market Project, the idea is to create a blueprint for what America will look like as a wholly free enterprise society, unregulated capitalism. And there's two really important parts of this story. Well, there's several, but I'll focus on two here today. One of the people hired as part of this initiative is George Stigler, an economist who wins the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for work arguing against regulation. He produces an edited version of The Wealth of Nations. Now, most people have never actually read The Wealth of Nations, but if you did read it, you might be surprised to find that Smith has a very extensive discussion of the need for government regulation, particularly of banks, and how if you don't regulate banks, the whole economy is put at risk. He also has an extensive discussion of the need to pay workers a decent amount of wage, And because the management always holds the power in any management worker situation, that workers should be allowed to create unions, to form collectives, and to work to protect themselves against managers who will always try to squeeze them. And it's a shockingly sympathetic discussion of workers for many of us who have been raised to think that Adam Smith was some kind of heartless capitalist. So The Wealth of Nations is a sophisticated, interesting, subtle, and nuanced book that by no means says that government is bad. Absolutely sees a role for government in regulating banks, also for taxation, has extensive discussions of the need for taxation. What does Stigler do with that? He gets rid of all of it. All of it. So all of Smith's important discussion about banking regulation, taxation, the rights of workers is all expunged. So, and that becomes a kind of popular version that is then marketed as something that can be used in schools. So if all you ever read was that version of Adam Smith, you might think that Adam Smith was a supporter of, wholly unregulated capitalism, but you would be wrong. And the Chicago School becomes a central node for that, promoting that vision, that false vision of Adam Smith. The other really important player in the story is Milton Friedman, of course, who many people have heard of. Friedman is arguably the most famous and influential, I guess one of the two most famous and influential economists of the 20th century, the other being John Maynard Keynes. And Friedman essentially is an anti-Keynesian. He wants to say that all of the arguments that Keynes has made in the 1920s and 30s about the need for governments to fix problems like the stock market crash and the Great Depression, that's all wrong. That government should just get out of the way and let the market do its magic. So who's funding this? If you read Milton Friedman's work and you didn't pay very close attention to some small little things here and there, you might have the impression that Friedman came to all these ideas independently or by reading Hayek. But in fact, Friedman's most famous book, the book Capitalism and Freedom, published in 1962, was based on a set of lectures that was funded by the Volcker Fund. So in other words, the same people who worked to bring von Hayek to America to promote a kind of degraded version of European neoliberalism also fund Milton Friedman to publish Capitalism and Freedom. That book goes on to be a massive bestseller. He's invited to do a regular column for Newsweek magazine. He becomes an advisor to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and also to the Chilean dictator Pinochet, and becomes one of the most powerful and influential voices in the second half of the 20th century, arguing against government regulation, against taxation, against government protections for workers and the environment.
And we also know basically how the next 40 years played out. Everything that he said would happen didn't happen. And, as the whole idea of trickle down economics, Reagan's version of Friedman actually played out, all it did was make income inequality here in America and other countries that tried the same thing so much worse. The book is called The Big Myth, and I think myth here being the key word because, like I said, so much of what is told in this story just did not ring true. So what is it about such flimsy and false economic theories that have allowed them to sustain for so long in the minds of Americans?
Well, I guess I'll take that on first. One of the things Naomi didn't say in her talking about Hayek and Milton Friedman especially is that these businessmen had the money, the wealth to hire the Chicago school folks to begin but then to also spread their ideas throughout the media. One of the things they learned during World War II was the enormous power of advertising on radio and TV and so forth, because during the war, the Roosevelt administration had a propaganda apparatus. It was incredibly effective, and they learned from that. So what you get when we start having the Friedmans and so forth is they're able to construct essentially an overwhelming propaganda apparatus. And so we begin to see these free market messages everywhere from the movies and we've got a chapter on movies, in children's books, really everywhere, and in the churches, because they also begin funding efforts to build free market curricula into seminaries, even, so that Americans would literally hear the same messages from every cultural institution practically in the United States, and they had the money to do it.
And I think that's such an important point, because we talk a lot on this podcast how it's actually the left that has owned popular culture, at least today. And, we laugh, as we've laughed with our guests, at conservative attempts at popular culture that have failed pretty miserably. But, after I read The Big Myth, I got to admit, I was so wrong. I mean, the right, this business-led right, was so successful at injecting these ideas into popular culture. You kind of touched on it, but can you provide a couple more examples of how they were able to do this?
During the late 20s and through most of the 1930s, American movies started to discuss the social programs of the Great Depression. And there was a great deal of criticism of wealthy people and of businessmen in the movies, an effort to focus more on sort of the problems of the common man, and even you'd see movies praising collective solutions, collective farming, and that kind of thing. At the end of World War II, there's a new chief in Hollywood hired by the name of Erik Johnston, who came earlier from the manufacturing associations, who came in and said, look, we're not going to make these problem films anymore. We only want movies that glorify American business, and then gets Ayn Rand to help write censorship codes that begin to also say things like, well, we can't criticize wealth, we can't bring up labor disputes, and so on. And they are successful over the 1940s and early 1950s of essentially redirecting movie culture away from these social problem films, and towards celebration of unbridled American capitalism.
Yeah, it sounds eerily familiar. Those that are fighting for, the freedom of everyone really are just fighting for the freedoms of a select few.
Yep, that's exactly right. But I want to say one thing: we all have grown to believe, with this belief that Hollywood culture is very leftist. But ask yourself, what are the most popular films year after year and decade after decade? And often they're very violent and very libertarian, even though Hollywood itself might be full of Democrats, right? I'm not so sure that really holds up in movie culture. Erik Johnston may have been right, and in the sense that he was so successful that we still don't make social problem films.
Marvel. Yes. Well, GE played a big role in all of this as well, right around the same time. Arguably, maybe one of the most critical roles, as it revamped the career of Ronald Reagan, turned him, from this B-list actor into a household name. What was GE Theater, and what role did it play in Reagan's path to basically dominating the minds of conservatives for the next 40 years?
So one of the things we show in the book is the way in which the business propaganda, how they target, as Erik just said, various aspects of American culture. So they target academia, they target politics, political debate, and they target popular culture. But in the story of Ronald Reagan, we see how the popular culture piece connects to the politics. So most Americans know, as you just said, that in the 40s and 50s, Ronald Reagan was a B-list actor, made some pretty stupid movies with chimpanzees. But what people may or may not know was that he was a pro-union, pro-government Democrat. But somewhere along the line, he changes. And much of that change we can identify as happening when he takes a job with the General Electric Corporation. So in the early to mid 50s, his career is kind of on the skids. Not much is happening for him. He has served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, so he has an important role as a union president, but he goes to work for GE, and the job has two parts. One part is hosting a television program that GE has developed called General Electric Theater. The program was very, very successful with Reagan as its host. It was one of the top 3 television shows in the United States in the late 1950s. And each week it featured a story, a didactic story, typically about American individualism, about a young man or a boy who learns to stand on his own 2 feet, learns to stand up for himself, and through his own hard work and labor becomes successful. So each week, Ronald Reagan's face is being streamed into millions of homes. So he becomes very, very well known to the American people. He becomes one of the most well-known actors in America at this time, telling these didactic, individualist, kind of anti-government stories. But meanwhile, he has another job at GE. And in some ways, I think the second job is, well, the first job is really important in terms of making him a household name in the United States. The second job is probably more important in terms of the evolution of his thinking. So as we said, he goes into GE, a union president, a Democrat, but he comes out an anti-union, anti-government Republican. So how does that happen? Well, GE was a very reactionary company. It had participated in extreme anti-union tactics that were so extreme that they developed a name. They were called bullwhitherism after the GE vice president who developed them. And they were so anti-union that GE was actually cited for violations of labor laws. Reagan's job at GE was to travel pushing the GE message, the anti-union, anti-government, pro-free enterprise message. He would give speeches in GE factories. He would visit towns where GE had facilities and meet with school teachers or school children or ministers, or give a talk in a Rotary Club in the evening. And then these events would be written up in the GE newsletters, GE magazines, and distributed to the hundreds of thousands of people who worked for General Electric all across the country. And in telling this story, making these speeches, he begins to hone what becomes his political speech, that government is the problem, not the solution, that taxation is theft, and he develops this style for which he later becomes famous with anecdotes that you don't know if they're actually true or not, but they're probably made up. And when he finishes working for GE, so he comes out with a new political ideology, a new persona, and also a third really important thing, a set of powerful, wealthy backers who then finance his campaign for governor of California, thus launching his political career.
Incredible. And then the rest, as they say, is history. The purpose of the Climate Pod has always been to try to understand why a very small percentage of humans basically has been allowed to warm the planet to dangerous levels, and while the government basically stood back and watched. So how has the big myth of market fundamentalism led us to where we are today in regards to the climate crisis?
You know, it's not a coincidence that Erik and I moved from working on climate change denial to writing this book, because as he said at the outset, we wanted to understand climate change denial. And it was very clear to us early on in doing this research that the people we were studying were not mostly motivated by money. They were not industry shills. They were motivated by a worldview of Weltanschauung that basically held that government action in the marketplace was putting us on a slippery slope to socialism or worse. And so we wanted to understand why anyone would think that, because the historical evidence doesn't support it. In fact, if anything, the opposite. The historical evidence suggests that FDR saved capitalism during the New Deal, and the United States and Germany prevented the rise of communism by treating workers better and having programs of social security and unemployment insurance and workmen's compensation. So what we've shown, really, I think, with the 2 books together, is the way in which a political ideology that was consciously developed by, I think, what we could fairly call the ruling classes to defend their prerogatives and their corporate profits has stood in the way of not just acting on the climate challenge, but even acknowledging it, even acknowledging this, because this is a market failure. And we're not the first people to say that. Nick Stern, a long time ago, former chief economist of the World Bank, said that climate change is the largest, greatest, and most wide-ranging market failure in human history. So this is an example of capitalism not working. People sell goods and services, they use fossil fuels. These activities are perfectly legal, and they're destroying our planetary climate in ways that are costing the world, well, according to the IMF, $1.5 trillion every single year. So this is a colossal external cost. It's a cost that's being born in many cases by completely innocent people who didn't burn those fossil fuels, right? I mean, most of the use of fossil fuels has taken place in the United States and Northern Europe, but a lot of the damage is taking place in places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. So it's an environmental injustice, it's a market failure, and it really shows the Achilles heel of capitalism as we practice it, that you could do things that are legal under a capitalist system and produce incredibly damaging, costly results and not be held at all accountable for those costs. So something's wrong with that picture. And so you either have to acknowledge that something's wrong with the picture and you need to think about what kinds of remedies are available, or you go into denial. And so much of our work has really been about understanding the motivations of denial and the way in which market fundamentalist thinking in the defense of unregulated or inadequately regulated capitalism is directly linked to climate change denial.
Well, through the works of people like you and from activists, politicians today seem to, maybe be getting it a little bit with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. The Biden administration has shown that it is willing to invest heavily in the infrastructure and the businesses that will actually make the lives of Americans better, do the things that the market hasn't been able to do. But knowing what you do know, what do you think will be the market fundamentalists' reaction to all of this?
Well, I think you already see the market fundamentalist reaction. You see the continued efforts to turn the public against renewable energy projects, for example. That's widespread. There was just recently some articles on the revival of NIMBYism, some of which is true. Lots of people don't want ugly industrial projects near their homes. And some of which is constructed by the availability of foundations and funds that are made available to help spread NIMBYism in lots of ways. So that's one reaction that we're already seeing. And of course, we also know that Republicans by and large don't vote for anything that smacks of climate either, not at the federal level anyway. A number of Republican-run states have actually taken on clean energy, right? Texas is the big one with wind power, though they still don't fix their own grid. It's a whole other set of stories, but it also fits in with the market fundamentalist view, right? They don't want their utilities regulated, so they don't participate in the federal network. So I think we see the market fundamentalist backlash already, but it isn't at all surprising, not even in the forms it's taking.
With Merchants of Doubt, and the audiences probably already felt like the executives of the tobacco industry, and probably to an extent the fossil fuel industry, were kind of these like Bond level villains already. No one really looked very highly upon them. Do you think that people are going to have a harder time coming to grips with the implications of the big myth, just because so many Americans have truly been indoctrinated by the myth of market fundamentalism?
Well, I maybe slightly take issue with your premise. I mean, when we first published Merchants of Doubt, honestly, a lot of people thought we were making a mountain out of a molehill. So there's 4 old guys, so what? And I think people, though, began to understand that the story was synecdoche, right? These 4 men were a window into this much larger network of climate change denial that included countless libertarian think tanks, foundations, places like the Cato Institute, journals like Forbes, Fortune, the Wall Street Journal. I should say Forbes has really changed, so want to acknowledge that. But even today, the Wall Street Journal continues to argue that climate change is just going to be fixed by letting unregulated markets do their magic. So I think it took people a while to understand that this was a big story and an upsetting story. So I think we'll see the same thing here. And in some ways, it is, as you suggest, even harder to accept, because it basically means we've all kind of been suckered, including a lot of liberals and progressives who, like in the 90s, accepted the arguments for market-based mechanisms because they seemed to have a certain validity, and they did have a certain validity. But when there was an actual opportunity for Republicans to vote for those market-based mechanisms, or for conservative businesses or the fossil fuel industry to support it, suddenly they all disappeared, right? And hardly any Republicans supported Waxman-Markey. No fossil fuel companies supported it. So. And I think we know already from the feedback we're getting, I mean, in a way, this is kind of a heartbreaking story. We've been asked a lot about the Little House on the Prairie books. Every female who I've done an interview with in the last week is like, oh my God, et tu, Brute. It's heartbreaking to realize how extensive these propaganda campaigns have been, and how things that we maybe cherished or things we believed were in fact part of a propaganda campaign. So that's something that I think a lot of people have to sit with, and there will certainly be people who will resist accepting it. But I think from the reception we're having already, it's also clear that a lot of people are saying, oh, well, that kind of makes sense, because these, I've always thought, Milton Friedman, if you actually read his books, they don't make any sense, and there's no evidence. I mean, Capitalism and Freedom is a virtually evidence-free book, and yet it's been incredibly influential. So why was that? Well, as we've just been saying, it didn't compete in a free marketplace of ideas. It was heavily promoted on a very unlevel playing field, because he had these incredibly wealthy corporate backers in his corner, in a way that many other people whose arguments were probably more valid in terms of the evidence of history or the evidence of economics didn't get the same opportunity to make the case to the American people.
That's exactly how I felt reading the book, The Little House on the Prairie stories. I mean, my parents loved the Michael Landon version, and we watched that as kids, and I could just say that over and over again about so many examples that were in this book. Merchants of Doubt was incredible. I remember reading that and absolutely loving that book. And then I've been lucky enough to read this book over the last couple of weeks, and I'm blown away by all that you were able to uncover, how you were able to tie all of it together into this coherent but also just horrifying story of how they were able to accomplish all of this. I'm just so grateful that you are willing to spend some time with me this afternoon and talk about it. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, and thank you for joining me today on the Climate Pod.
You're very welcome. It's been our pleasure.
Yep. Thanks for having us.